My name is Katie Goldstein, and I'm the Executive Director of Tenants and Neighbors. It's really great to see so many familiar faces in the crowd and folks who've been working to strengthen the rent laws and preserve affordable housing for so long in their different neighborhoods and across the city. We are also members of the Alliance for Tenant Power, another tenant coalition that is co-sponsoring this event. And I want to talk a little bit about why this fight this year is so critical, even though I know that so many in the audience are here because the fight is so critical. Just some background about rent regulation. Rent regulation is the largest source of affordable housing for low-income tenants in New York. It houses approximately 2.5 million people, and it's 1 million units. And we've lost hundreds of thousands of rent-regulated units in the past 20 years, and this is the year where we really think that needs to end. So, within this context of the worst affordability crisis that the city has ever seen, we've lost these hundreds of thousands of units, and over a third of rent-stabilized tenants are paying 50% or more of their income in rent. And so this has meant that there's been rampant gentrification and displacement pressures in many neighborhoods throughout the city, working class neighborhoods, communities of color, immigrant communities, all these communities that really make New York great. And so we've come together to try to fight this year to make this the year that deregulation is repealed and the rent laws are strengthened. That's right.
What we're dealing with here is a very powerful real estate industry. There's very large campaign contributions, lots of which go to upstate politicians who don't have a single rent-regulated constituent in their districts. They don't have any great incentive to protect housing or affordable housing in New York. They have tremendous incentives to collect those campaign contributions. In addition to which, you have the deep pockets of the real estate industry that, as was mentioned earlier, goes into television ads and oftentimes radio ads up in Albany, where the listeners don't really understand what's going on with housing and the affordability crisis in New York. They don't see the homeless on our trains and in our public spaces on a daily basis, as I increasingly do and you all do. And so there's a tremendous propaganda campaign, and a lot of it is just built on a foundation of real spin and nonsense. What we're dealing here is when people who are not accountable to constituents have a tremendous amount of power over their future and their lives. We're dealing with arbitrary power. What we're dealing with in the city right now is an imbalance where tenants, because of either declining or flattening incomes, have not been able to keep up with the cost of housing, which makes it particularly outrageous that landlords in the city, even those who own rent-regulated, rent-stabilized buildings, have done so well over the last several years. Since 1990, according to the Rent Guidelines Board staff, their income has gone up over 32% in inflation-adjusted dollars. According to my own calculations, in order to keep owners whole, and that is to protect their net operating income from the effects of inflation, they would have had to have had 142% in rent increases since 1990. The Rent Guidelines Board authorized 188% in increases, in addition to which their incomes have been supplemented by unnecessary process of deregulation, MCI increases, and individual apartment increases have become permanent components of the rents, ridiculous rules with regard to preferential rents, and where overcharges occur and tenants try to hang on to what little rights they have remaining, the state legislature has cut them off at the knees with a ridiculous 4-year rule, which basically says if you've robbed the bank for more than 4 years, you can continue to do so and you're perfectly protected. So what we're getting is a lot of arbitrary rules, a lot of destructive rules, and kind of thoughtless rules that have led to the housing affordability crisis, which was so eloquently described. We have a number of critical problems that are addressed by the rent reform campaign. I'm just going to mention them generally. Preferential rents. Oftentimes, landlords can have these large increases in their legal rents. They offer, in order to deal with the market or induce tenants to come in, lower rents. But then if they don't like the tenant, for sometimes tactical reasons or capricious reasons, they'll just jump those rents. I've seen rents go up $1,000. People just lose their homes as a result. Really in an arbitrary way. Permanent MCIs. The city has in the past studied the MCI program. The MCI program produces incredible windfalls for owners. I actually believe in the MCI program and the individual apartment program because there should be incentives for owners to improve their buildings. They should be adequately compensated and get a fair return. But what's happening is they've got an excessive return, which creates some perverse incentives sometimes to do work that's really unnecessary. And oftentimes we have the additional problem of the state agency which oversees these things not adequately scrutinizing the expenses that owners claim to be spending. A lot of times these things are padded and there's a lot of fraud that goes on. And then of course the big problem with vacancy deregulation. That was an effort engineered by the real estate industry, first implemented in the 1990s to bleed the rent regulation system and eventually kill it. And they are well on their way to doing it. And it's the incentive of the industry to get the legislature to adopt long-term extensions of rent regulation without any reforms so that they can continue to watch the system fall apart. And the other thing is when you think about this, the kinds of deregulation that are occurring are really in higher-end buildings where owners are making a tremendous amount of money to begin with. There was no real need for that. And then finally, I want you to really understand what it is that drives this housing scarcity in the city. It's complex. We've had an in-migration of about 1 million people over the last few decades, in addition to which the city faces a number of quality of life constraints, environmental issues, the need for adequate parking and living space and so on. So there is strict zoning, there are landmarks controls and buildings regulations to keep buildings safe. Those things do suppress at some level new supply.
Conclude your remarks.
I will. And as a result, owners of existing properties have the windfall of that scarcity, and rent regulation is designed to countervail that extra bargaining leverage, that extraordinary market power they have. And without it, it would be a disaster for tenants. Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, well look, as Tim laid out, we all know the defining characteristics of this city's rental market. Tight supply, few vacancies, soaring rents, particularly at a time when the city has been experiencing a surge in population growth that's expected to continue over the next decade. In that kind of so-called cutthroat market, in that kind of so-called cutthroat market, it's clear that owners and landlords have the upper hand over tenants, and that's exactly the problem that rent regulation is intended to address. Let me provide a kind of analytic picture of the market since 2007, just before the Great Recession. These figures include all renters, whether they're living in regulated units, in unregulated units, public housing, or subsidized housing. Over that period since 2007, contract rents increased by 36%. On the average, the rent guidelines board 1 year increases rose by 20%. So those increases, as Tim laid out, are part of the problem. If you look at renter incomes, compare that, they increased by only 8% over that period. And if we look at rent burdens, that is the proportion of household income that went toward paying rent, that increased by 7%. Now over those few years, that's a startling increase in rent burdens, which tend to be pretty stable over time. Now for low-income tenants, at CSS we define those as those within twice the poverty level, roughly up to $38,000 for a family of 3. The picture is similar to the overall picture, but the consequences are catastrophic. Median rent burdens for low-income New Yorkers rose from 48% to 52% of household income. The number of units affordable to them dropped by 30% since 2002, a very, very rapid sliding away of the affordable stock. If you're poor, by the federal definition, Once you pay your rent, all you have left is about $4.50 a day per person in your household. That's not enough to get you a round trip on the subway. Of the 1 million households that are currently rent regulated, a substantial proportion of them, about 42%, 420,000 households, live in rent-regulated units. About 300,000 are in unassisted regulated units, and another 84,000 have vouchers and are living in units in the open market that are still rent regulated. So rent regulation is very clearly a low-income issue in New York City. For them, rent-regulated units, as Tim pointed out, are the primary source of housing. However, while rent regulation provides protections, it is far, as we know, it is far from perfect. In 2011, the median rent burden for low-income tenants in regulated units was 44%, against a 47% burden in unregulated units. So we can see that while regulation keeps the rent pressure down, it has not yet been successful in bringing about affordable rents within the regulated stock. And that's as a result of soaring rents in both the regulated and unregulated stock. To make matters worse, over the past decade, the number of stabilized units has decreased rapidly by the hundreds of thousands of regulated units. It's decreased largely through vacancy decontrol as apartments are vacated, through improvements that are costly and tenants are priced out.
Mr. Locke, if you could conclude your remarks.
Through the hikes in preferential rents and the like. It is no surprise that the number of homeless families in the city has reached unprecedented levels. Thank you very much.
You know, the rent laws are what protect our tenants, or at least are what's supposed to protect our tenants. And that's not what's happening. Our landlords are actually using the rent laws to be able to harass our tenants so they can leave and they can increase the rents. We really need to stick together. We need to shout out to Albany and tell them they must renew. And not just only renew, but straighten these rent laws. We need to fight together. Thank you.
We need strong rent laws. As the public advocate said, we have over 60,000 families who are homeless, and that number is sure to rise. There's a building right now in Brooklyn, 285 Schenectady. Their landlord is raising their rent. Their rent is going to go from $900 to $2,500 a month. That is 62 families. Where they're supposed to go. Let me just say, we need to band together. What we do have, we have people power. We need to show up in numbers at every event for every tenant group that organizes or has a rally, because it's up to us to change this law. If we don't show up, they don't really care. We have to show up in numbers because we do have people power. Just remember, the same way we're organizing, those landlords are sitting down and they're organizing. But we have people power. Thank you.
Thank you.
But understand that this is a problem that needs to be solved in Albany. And though our new Assembly Speaker, Carl Hastie, has come out publicly in favor of strengthening the rent laws, someone even more important has, up until a couple of days ago that is, would have said was conspicuously silent, but no longer. At some comments made at a Better New York breakfast a couple days ago, Governor Cuomo said this: at minimum, we have to extend those protections, talking about the rent laws. And then he goes on to say something about finer negotiations on these delicate points is going to be problematic. What the heck does that mean? What is this double talk? And where is the governor going with this? I want to know the answer to that question. I don't know about you. The question for Governor Cuomo should be to ask himself, what will be the benefit to me in the form of votes if I throw my weight behind strengthening the rent laws when they come up for renewal on June 15th? That's what he should be asking himself. So my advice to the governor is, don't put your eggs in the wrong basket. Put your eggs in the basket because they have a few votes, we have a few million. Don't get it twisted. That's all.
Thank you so much for attending this forum. We're going to be facing an important fight in Albany, and we're going to need all of the support that we can get. Earlier, you had a panelist who talked about one of the main causes of eviction. And what he said was that the main reason, well, a large reason is because people simply cannot afford the rent, leading them to go into shelter. And this reminded me of my time as a trial attorney in Queens, where I did eviction prevention representation in housing court. And from the time that I started until the time I was ending my tenure there, I started to see a large change in the people that were in housing court. You started to see an increase in number of people who were working, people who may have 2 incomes in the household, but no matter what they did, they could not keep up with the rent. The rents were increasing due to all the mechanisms that my fellow panelists talked about, the MCIs, the individual apartment improvements, the vacancy bonuses, and unfortunately people's incomes were not keeping pace. So what I would see is people who, one, have to take off of work to attend court and lose that time because a lot of people were in employment situations where if they don't show up, they don't get paid. And we thank the City Council for addressing that with sick leave, but back then that was a big problem. So, you had situations where people were doing a number of things to try to keep up with the rent. There were some grants available through charitable organizations, through social services agencies, but a lot of people just could not keep pace. And what we found is that there's record homelessness as a result of this. There are 60,000 that are currently in shelter, and that's increased from previous years. People's rent burdens have increased. Typically, you're considered rent burden if you're paying more than 30% of your income in rent. What we've seen in the past 3 years alone is a increase from 34% to 36% of half of the rent stabilized tenants that are paying that amount of their income towards rent. There are tens of thousands of people who are paying over 70% of their income in the rent. Meanwhile, median rents have increased in that same period from about $1,070 to $1,200. Then there's the overcrowding situation where people are doubling up in order to avoid shelter. A lot of those families eventually end up in shelter. I myself, in addition, volunteer in a shelter. And while these shelters are supposed to be temporary placements, there are tons of families that have been there for several years, and it's not clear when they're going to be able to leave, just because the level of the rents and the family size and incomes just not keeping pace. So to the extent that the rent laws are a mechanism by which we can maintain affordability, I think that that needs to be a focal point for all tenants in New York. We have 1 million apartments that are left in 1 million rent stabilized apartments that are left in New York City. We've lost 50,000 units in the past 4 years. Over the last 10 years, we've lost about 250,000 units. So the supply is dwindling. The rents, the laws as they stand, will allow that to continue. It'll be just a march towards the end of rent stabilization, which is what the landlords want. I'm pretty sure they would be very happy with a long extender that would allow the laws as they are to stay in place, and that would mean the slow death to rent stabilization. So it's very important that we make changes to the law, and that we bring fairness, and that we maintain affordability.
Thank you.
We talked about the importance of renewing the rent laws, but if we walk away with nothing else, it's very, very important that we fight for repeal of vacancy destabilization. If we get nothing else, we must push our elected officials to make sure that that is ensured, because what's happening is these property owners, these landlords, they have an incentive. Their incentive is to convert these affordable units and make them market rate. As long as there's an incentive, they will continue to spend hand over fist whatever is needed. They will continue to legally and illegally do what is necessary to convert those units. So again, repealing of vacancy destabilization is very, very important. If our elected officials think a simple renewer is okay, we need to understand that that would be a fraud to the rent-stabilized tenants and to the movement.
Good morning. I'm really glad to be here. As our public advocate said, I worked in legal services and community organizations for over 25 years and spent an inordinate amount of my life in housing court. I'm now privileged to work for our Manhattan Borough President, and it feels like a continuation of the struggle. And it isn't just a struggle about laws, cold black and white laws on the books. It's a struggle for the very diversity and character of our city. And I want to sum up why everyone's been pointing out that we have to urge our elected representatives in Albany to make sure that the rent stabilization laws are not just renewed but reformed. And I'm going to steal a line from Mike McKee, who explains to us that the rent stabilization law as it is now contains the seeds of its own destruction. It will, if left alone the way it is, we will not have any rent stabilized apartments. It's just a matter of time. And I also think that we have to, especially with some of the facets of the rent stabilization law, they work together with the worst meaning landlords. They interact in a beautiful synchronicity to harass tenants, to gain vacancies, to continue the hemorrhaging of rent-regulated apartments that we've been experiencing. Right now, the vacancy bonus combined with vacancy deregulation is like a big target on the backs of rent-stabilized tenants. We have to get rid of it. All the other aspects of the current rent stabilization law work to benefit people who are trying to vacate apartments. They do not do repairs. They get a vacancy. Sometimes tenants actually still move out because the apartments become unlivable. They then put in a new functioning appliances, and they jack up the rents through IAIs. It's not that they're not examined by DHR, they're not even looked at. Then it works with the preferential rent system, the scheme, where a landlord will charge tenants an affordable rent, but meanwhile is registering a completely illegal rent. That tenant who has an affordable rent is not going to investigate the legality of that rent. Time goes by, it magically becomes legal. And it's all over, and they pull the preferential rent away. That apartment probably will result in eviction. MCIs, which go on and on and on, also inexorably move that apartment rent up to the point where people can't afford the $2,000 rent. They have to move out. Boom, between the vacancy bonus and a new refrigerator, it's deregulated. So all of these facets in the current law work together to beautifully, in fact, to make sure that there's going to be a depletion of rent-regulated apartments as the years go on. It's inexorable. And I wanted to talk a little bit. We all know how important it is to get reform of some of these these aspects of the rent stabilization law. We also, I would say, need to be vigilant here in the city. We have a wonderful administration, a rare opportunity where we have a government that's committed to increasing affordable housing. We have to make sure there's an equal commitment to not losing the affordable housing we have. As the public advocate said, we have to support more tenants and a right to counsel for tenants in housing court. We also have to push the administration for greater enforcement of the existing laws. We have great regulations, health and safety and building regulations in this city. They must be enforced for the benefit of our citizens. Lack of enforcement works together, hand in hand, with the scheme of landlords who want to leave tenants with unlivable conditions, force them out, then just do minor repairs. Just make the apartment livable and jack up the rent by hundreds of dollars. The city must do its part by enforcing its laws. And I also want to say that we also have to watch the city and make sure, we know they're well-intentioned, but let's make sure that our homeless population is not used as a pawn to jack up rents in illegally high, otherwise regulated units and put them where the city will pay an exorbitant illegal rent to house homeless families. And when their benefits are gone, they can't afford those rents. And guess what? A previously regulated or affordable unit is now out of stabilization and unaffordable. I think we all have to do everything we can do to make sure that these loopholes are closed, because it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. If we want to continue rent stabilization, if we want it to have real meaning, we have to change the laws that make it self-destructive. Thank you.
What do we want? Affordable housing. I can't hear you. What do we want?
Jacking up the rent by 10%.
When do
My
we
pay
want
ain't
it?
increased.
What
Damn
do
it,
we
but the
want?
rent goes higher as I perspire. Can't afford the AC cause the rent is higher. Cut back more. Bye-bye cable TV. Doing the rabbit ears cause it's free. Gotta sell the car, do the mass transit cause I can't afford a parking ticket.